Good evening, Scotland, and welcome to this annual STUC Black History Month lecture. Normally, we would be meeting in person in Clydebank to have this lecture, but with the coronavirus pandemic, we have all had to respond, and that includes us at the STUC and at the STUC Black Workers Committee. Therefore, I'm delighted that we can all come together in this virtual space and still hear from a very good speaker on the theme this year, which is around Black and minority ethnic representation in the workplace and in society. My name is Usman Ali, and I am the chair of the STUC Black Workers Committee. This year, our keynote campaign is called Break the Race Ceiling. Break the Race Ceiling campaign mainly focuses on the public sector, but we will soon be outreaching to the private and third sectors in Scotland too, to challenge employers to tell us what data they hold in terms of the BAME workforce that they employ, and also what tailored action they take to understand BAME communities, to recruit BAME people as part of their workforce, and then help retain BAME people as part of the workforce and help give them the skills and confidence to progress into the senior and strategic roles. Those of you who follow our work will know that I had the privilege of launching the Break the Race Ceiling campaign at another virtual rally we did in the summer. And in June, I wrote to 150 public sector employers to ask them some of those questions that I've just mentioned. To date, we've had about 41 responses, and we're now in the process of chasing up the remaining group that is still to respond. You'll be hearing more about the Break the Race Ceiling campaign throughout the lecture and in the Q&A that follows. And I would ask everyone to please post your questions whilst we're hearing from our speaker. And I'm also delighted that at the Q&A, I'm joined by our Vice Chair, Diljit, who will be answering some of the questions with me and our speaker. Turning to our speaker this year is Graham Campbell. Graham Campbell is known by being elected as a Glasgow City Councillor, but also as Scotland's first male councillor of African Caribbean background. And I'm delighted that Graham has agreed to join us this year and present this year's lecture. I hope you find what he has to say very interesting, and please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. So without further ado, can I please introduce Councillor Graham Campbell? Thank you.
Good evening, colleagues, comrades, friends, fellow trade unionists. As a member of the Musicians Union, I'm very pleased to be greeted by a vice chair, also from my union, who is, with any luck, going to be our first BAME woman on the executive committee of the MU. It's a union I've had an association with for a very long time. And we're starting right there with representation within our movement, because obviously this is an island where Black workers, Asian workers, members from minority ethnic communities have flocked to the trade unions as one of the places where the anti-racist agenda, where their rights as workers, where their rights as communities is raised. And it's something that's been a central part of Black British politics from day one. Our members, our family members have joined trade unions and sought trade union support for the struggle for racial equality in Britain. So I want to flag up the fact that's why I find it important to be a member of a trade union today. So we're talking about representation, and I'm going to sort of talk about BME representation in three senses. There is BME representations at work, and therefore specifically I'll deal with something around what Glasgow City Council is doing, because that's the one I know best about, but it gives an idea of what kind of changes I think can be done and what should be done. I'll also talk about representation in the sense of how we are portrayed and how we are represented in the culture, and we'll talk about a bit about the slavery legacy and why that's important to recognize the racism of yesterday in the racism of now. And finally, in terms of electoral representation, as some of you know, that's something I'm quite involved in. Having been elected, I understand some of the barriers that many candidates in the past have faced and that they're currently facing now in the process of making our parliament a much more diverse place. The fact that our parliament has only had 4 BAME members of parliament in its history, currently has just 2, and they've all been men from South Asian backgrounds. So that doesn't really reflect even the diversity of the BAME communities. It's time that we need to have a parliament that's more representative. So I'll talk a bit about that in my final section. But I hope that you'll see the thread I'm running through all of these aspects of representation. So let's start with the nitty-gritty. We're a trade union movement, therefore we want to know what happens at work. In Scotland, there is a clear issue because about maybe half the jobs pre-COVID outbreak were probably in some way or other dependent on public sector authority spending, whether it was by the central government, whether it's by local government, or whether it was by public bodies like courts, police, and so on. So if you look at all of the measures and all the interventions into the economy by our government, local and national, you'll see that a large percentage of this country's employment is dependent on bodies that are covered by the public sector equality duties and the Equalities Acts. So you'd have thought then in a country like ours, where the public sector plays such a big role, where you have such a concentration and elevation and importance of the struggle for racial equality, you would think that our results would be reflecting in the makeup of the workforce. And I don't have to tell you, you can tell us, and I'm sure that we'll talk about that in the chat box, about the lack of BAME representation throughout our public sector. And I'm going to deal specifically with Glasgow, because when I first started campaigning on this, which would have been about sort of 2005, 2006, and then when I briefly worked for the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, it was one of the things I was raising in around 2007. I wrote some documentation about the very low level, of African and Asian and Chinese employment in the council itself. At that time, the council had about, I think it was about 14,000 employees in 2007, there enough. And there were at that point just 400, just under 500 BAME employees of all different ethnicities. That made 1%, less than 1% of the workforce in a city that at that time, 2007, you were talking about between 7 and 10% of the population of Glasgow being BME. Today, we're talking about a population that's 15% BME in the adult population. It's 20% BME when you're talking about our students at school and therefore our future workforce. So the idea that dealing with BAME employment is a marginal thing, that is for the birds. The reality is that institutionalized racism has directly affected and impacted their employment in the most important employer in our city, which is the council. The council today has just over 20,000 employees. I think it's 24,000 if I remember rightly. And 2 years after we started intervening very actively, we formed a BME employment working group, a cross-party working group, where we linked up with the heads of HR and the equalities leads within the council. And we looked at all the different departments. We're responsible to measure and contrast and look at what each different department is doing. And what we were finding is that where we did have BAME employees, they were overwhelmingly concentrated in the lowest 2 grades, grades 1 and 2. And that accounts for about 60% of the BAME employees we have. I have to tell you that today, and I'm excluding here from teacher numbers, they're not including the stats I'm talking about, but as of November 2019, we have 480 BAME employees. If you look at where they are in the progression, it's still about 55% are in those bottom 2 grades. What that tells you is that even when we're successful in getting people in the door, we're not being successful at getting them progressing their careers up through the organisation. Another factor we've seen in public bodies, and we see this in the police, in courts, and in councils, is that people join the organisation, they get through the processes of being interviewed, getting their application read, getting them employed, and then they don't stay. They're not retained. And partly that's down to experience, whether they feel welcome within the environment or not, or sometimes it's simply that their qualifications are not recognised. They may be they may be underemployed, which is a big feature of BME employment that you see in the wider economy, that BME people are far more likely to be educationally qualified to a degree level, more than twice as likely as white candidates in the labour market, but they are also 2 or 3 times more likely to be unemployed and underemployed at the level that they're coming in. So we're finding that there are very highly qualified people who work for us, but who are not doing jobs that are commensurate with what they have trained for. You have civil engineers doing clerical duties, or financial officers who are doing basic admin duties. So even when they're not doing a job that reflects what they can do and the contribution they can make. Our employment working group looked at some of the processes, and the motion that we put to council back in 2017 to set up the group talked about a number of remedies that we could make that would actively change things. Now, this is in a context. Sure that probably many of you are aware that in 2016, the Scottish Government published a race equality framework, which looked into some of these issues and looked at the employment, education, health, you name it, looked across the board, 100-page reports recommending actions that it would take to remedy this issue of the lack of BAME employment in the public sector. That then led to the duty on councils and public bodies to publish annual race equality action plans. And that led to documents that are produced now every October, November, which then are published, which then we can be measured against for our performance. So these race equality action plans are published now every year by councils and by public bodies. We are meant to therefore have measures to tackle that. So in response to that, we looked at a number of measures. There's a list of about 25 of them, but the gist of them are this. We saw that the actual practice of recruiting only in-house, advertising jobs only in-house to council employees already, was of course excluding all of those people who don't work for us, which, by the way, is most of the black community. So we were automatically creating an institutionalized barrier to employment. So we removed that. The next thing we needed to do was direct recruitment and employment and encouragement of jobs fairs aimed specifically at BME communities. And we've been doing that for the last 2 or 3 years very successfully. We've been getting all the different departments of the council. One of the things we've looked at is that we can see that actually a lot of people in the community don't fully know all the different types of work and employment that we offer. So we made sure that all the departments are represented, that the different types of grades and jobs that are possible were advertised. And that's been successful in getting more BME applicants. One of the complaints before was, oh, black people aren't applying. I know this from experience because I've applied for jobs to the council back in the day and failed to get interviews, failed to get shortlisted, and sometimes even failed to get the response. That was back in the day, but I had that experience myself. So it wasn't something that I felt that was an encouraging place to apply for work for. What's changed, I suppose, is that in the workforce itself, there is a series of equality champions and leads. There is a BAME employment staff network now, like a lot of places in the public sector, which is working quite well. We meet regularly. We set up a process that when people applied for work, that they could confidentially report how the process of applying has been. And that has revealed a lot of interesting questions about how people are perceived when they apply. One of the things that was flagged up for us was that we need to anonymize the applications so that people didn't know what country even you came from. They didn't know your name. They just knew what's your qualifications, what's your experience. And on that basis, we found that black workers were far more likely to get shortlisted and far more likely to get interviewed. So that worked. But what we then found was that at interview, black applicants who got to interview and got shortlisted, before we took these actions, we found that they were, I think, 2 or 3 times more likely to not get the job. So we wanted to say, well, what is it that they're not knowing? What system knowledge don't they have that the candidates who are getting those jobs ahead of them? What's happening? And we've worked out that it's really system knowledge. Things like having internal sort of mentoring schemes, making sure that you have some knowledge of the organisation before you work there. You have a distinct advantage if you already work for the council, then you have some knowledge that somebody who's outside it doesn't have. And because black workers by and large were outside, that was a disadvantage they had. So we've tried to make accessible schemes where people can know what that's like before they even apply for a job. So that we've done graduate recruitment aimed and targeted at BAME candidates. And that has, through this process, successfully increased the number of applicants and finally increased the number of actual staff. We went from 1.6% in 2017 to now about 3.4%. We've more or less doubled the BAME workforce in our council in the last 3 years. But it's nowhere near the proportionate level of employment there should be. In a population that's 15% adult BME, and where young workers will make up 20% of the population, that is nowhere near good enough. The extra measures do need to be taken. So we've had to go through a list of several things to work out how we're going to shift that. It will take some time, but if we were waiting the amount of time it was going to take under the previous system, I worked out that it would take us 107 years to get to a proportionate level of employment. Now, I'm going to live a long time, but I'm not going to live that long. So we're not going to wait that long. These changes are required. If we've learned nothing from this year, from the Black Lives Matter protests from George Floyd, from Sheku Bayo to everything, institutionalized racism is something that young black people who've grown up in Scotland this last 20 years with a Scottish government, with our councils, with our Scottish public bodies, that exclusion, the daily racism in their lives that they have faced from school, in work, out of work, in education, is no longer acceptable. It wasn't acceptable for me, but it's been acceptable in public life to all this time to tolerate that lack of performance and lack of response by the public sector in shifting these statistics. We obviously start from a place which involves two sort of falsehoods in the minds of people who run the public bodies. One of them is Scotland doesn't have a problem with racism. Well, quite famously, we know that we definitely do. And we've got lots of good radical academics who've proven that that's the case. Our life experience also proves that, but that's another story. The other thing we sort of worked out from this is that we have another false narrative, which is, oh, well, we can't possibly be discriminated because we're all Jack Thompson's bands, and we have this automatic equality without actually having to bother to be actively anti-racist. And that can't wash anymore, because the experience shows that the institution, despite whoever's in it, how nice they might be, the institution will still discriminate against BME workers if it's not changed, if the practices and processes and procedures are not changed. And finally, I'll say that even having Black and Asian councillors in the chamber has not changed the institutional discrimination of the organisation, because these are cultural practices, these are employment practices, these are little closed shops in different departments as to how they interview and operate, which are different, which in their own way, at each stage, exclude BME workers from even entering. Never mind what then happens once they're in, whether they get seniority, whether they're respected in their work roles as team leaders, or whether they get the chance to go for that particular post or that opportunity or that secondment. These are things that we're looking at in the round, and these are some of the measures that we've taken to shift the numbers. And I think that we've made progress because we've concentrated on those details. One of the things we do, we meet every 6 weeks in the Employment Working Group, and we measure the stats. Each department must come through HR, tell us what their stats are at that moment. One of the underperforming ones was, in fact, education. Despite the fact that education is quite a big chunk of the workforce, about 3,000 people, very, very few BME teachers, and in fact, nil BME head teachers and senior teachers. That's been remedied only recently. In the last few months, a new black head teacher was recruited. But up until this year, we had zero for a while. So this is the issue, that we've got massively unrepresentative workforces and councils which have laws in place, which have equality and duties in place, public bodies with those things in place. We now have to be measured against the performance of how we tackle that inequality and how we act to reduce it. These are the measures we now must take, and that haven't been taken for quite a few years. I hope you'll see that in my work in this area, I've tried very hard to muscle down on the detail, making sure that the people responsible in the various departments are held to account. Obviously, councillors are there to be held to account too, but we need to work together to make sure with the community that these positions are accessible. Clearly, this is going to be more difficult for us to do in a recessionary environment, and then possibly in the post-COVID environment. These are going to be more difficult things to do. But just because they're difficult, it doesn't mean that equality and justice for all, justice for BME communities and for BME workers should wait. It can't wait, because if we build back better without building out racism and discrimination in our workforce, we will not have the kind of society we want to have afterwards. So that's my brief journey through representation within the workforce at Glasgow City Council. Oh, by the way, I should point out that we passed a motion in September responding to the Black Lives Matter movement. We responded by setting ourselves an aspirational target. Now, we can't legally impose this target, but we aspired to get to 6% of our workforce as BME by 2022. And we've additionally given ourselves an extra target by 2030, 10 years' time, of getting to a proportionate level of employment of BAME communities in our workforce. Now, that's going to be a tough ask. It's going to require every year doing the sort of things we've done in the last 2 years. But I think it's doable, and it must be doable. But the fact we set ourselves a target, I hope other councils do the same. That's the trajectory we're on. But part of that motion also talked about representation in the sense of our history. A lot has been said, and you'll be aware of many of the discussions we've had around street names from slave masters, slave owners. You'll have seen some of the work I've done on this in terms of addressing the merchant city, so-called, the slavery legacy, the names of Buchanan, Ingram, even the Goma, the Losses House, as we call it in history circles. It's our legacy as a city and as a country is riddled with the dried blood of slavery and the enslavement of African people whose labor created the environment that we have. Our city and our country became rich of 3 or 4 key commodities, but for Glasgow, the 3 ones were tobacco, sugar, cotton. And it's the wealth that was generated from enslaved Africans producing those goods that set up our whole trading system, our whole industrial base, and the Glasgow's existence as a major international port. That it has its origins in that time, and the capital that was used to profit from those people built our buildings, built our institutions like Glasgow University, but also even our Lord Provosts, people who sat in the seats that I'm sitting in now. Back in the day, 200 years ago, would have owned slave plantations. They wouldn't have expected to see someone like me sitting on their benches now. So we have this legacy. That representation goes back a long way. The way we have been represented as Black people has been as if we're not connected to the story of Scotland at all, as if we're not connected to the story of Glasgow at all. But of course, Scotland has had the presence of Africans since at least 40 BC, when the Emperor Septimus Severus had his fort at Cramond in Edinburgh. He invaded Scotland as part of the Roman attempt to colonize Britain, but he was an African emperor from Libya who became the Roman emperor. So many of the soldiers on that Hadrian's Wall and on the Antonine War were from North Africa and from Egypt. So Africans have been in Scotland a long time, yet there's a sort of perception that we've had nothing to do with Scotland's history. Well, the one thing about the slavery legacy that we've now learned much more about, thanks to the work of people like Stephen Mullen, Sir Tom Devine, Sir Jeff Palmer, is that we know that Scotland was deeply involved in slavery and colonialism. No more can we perpetrate the false narratives that somehow Scotland wasn't involved, it's this poor oppressed little country, or that Britain abolished slavery and we had nothing to do with the 250 years before abolition, where we were the biggest perpetrators of slavery. So both those mythical nationalist narratives about ourselves have been challenged by the emergence of these facts about our involvement. I suppose I should say that just earlier today, we launched the Beneba Centre for Slavery Studies, which is the fruit of the work that we've done with Glasgow University to link them with the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean, and also to make a reparative justice act in relation to the legacy of slave owners' money, helping to build the Gilbert Scott building at Glasgow University. Glasgow University already named one of its main buildings, the James McCoon Smith building, which is the new student hub that you see being built on University Avenue. You've already seen a plaque unveiled to the memory of the enslaved Africans who were owned by Robert Bogle, who sold his mansion house site to build Glasgow University's campus on. So they're recognised and remembered. But I was very honoured 2 years ago to raise the Jamaican flag, to be there at the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between Glasgow University and the University of the West Indies, which established what is now called the Beneba Centre for Slavery Studies, which was launched today at 3 o'clock. So go and have a look on their website. This thing is being paid for by a reparative justice payment from Glasgow University, spending £1 million a year for the next 20 years to develop that study, look into more of the evidence, bring more of that evidence to light, and train scholars on both sides of the Atlantic that will contribute to the future correct telling of the full story of slavery and colonialism between Scotland and the Caribbean and the Americas. So that is important as a background to explain that if we understand that racism comes from somewhere, it doesn't come from nowhere. The Slave Code of Barbados in 1680, which the British introduced, institutionalized the lack of human rights of the enslaved Africans they had kidnapped and sent to islands like Barbados and Jamaica. But that first slave code in 1630 was the first place, 1680 was the first place in the British Empire where slavery formally took away the human rights of Africans enslaved and treated them as chattel. The racialized language you see in that slave code, the threat to their lives if they dared to rebel, which of course they did, but the total draconian capital punishment used, the rape, the torture, the pillage, was institutionalized in the laws. Slavery was made legal by the British, and many of those British were Scots. So it's not an accident that a racism that comes from that origin, which comes from essentially a genocide that took place over 250 years before it was finally abolished because slaves made it impossible to no longer remain enslaved because of the rebellions. The planters were forced to give up. But unfortunately, we compensated the plantation owners, not the enslaved Africans. And as you know, until 2015, we were still paying off what was the biggest bailout of its time in the 1830s after abolition. We were paying for the compensation of the slave owners right until 2015. So if you paid taxes before 2015, it was only then that we finally finished paying that public debt off. Still, so slavery money is not past money, it's current money. So we're looking at, well, if that's how we were represented in the history of this country, in other words, we weren't represented at all, how do we change that? How do we mitigate that? And the answer clearly is that we have to have a proper historical memory. Partly it's telling the truth about the great benefactors and founders whose statues and whose names are on our streets and questioning them. Not removing the evidence entirely, but we've got to question them and tell the true story about them. You'll know the story of the Dundas Memorial, which that documentary produced last week, and how the representation of Henry Dundas's actual role in prolonging and perpetuating slavery for another 15 years is a hotly contested act of politics right now, because it speaks to a sort of fake liberalism. The idea that Henry Dundas would have supported Black Lives Matter is a bit insulting, to say the least, but it gives you an idea that the pushback against a correct historical telling of Scotland's narrative in terms of its relationship to African people in particular, we're going to get that. And we need to be ready with answers which start with historical truth. And that's why we need to do the study centres. That's why we need to tell the true story. But in more modern times, we need to be telling the true story of African people's contributions to Scotland's life right now. Today, we're talking about the impact of COVID-19 and the over-representation of African and Asian employees in the health service and indeed in the wider community, their overexposure to this virus. But that tells you that the contribution we're making is not being fully understood by many of the citizens who are here. You couldn't explain the UK Brexit vote partly without a myopia and a complete forgetting that all of those nurses, professionals, educationalists who have been paid for with the tax dollars of the countries they came from have been purchased for free by us to be used in our health service. We've benefited from their entire working lives. Meanwhile, Jamaica alone has sent something like 700,000 nurses over the last 70 years, but it still doesn't have a proper health service that's up to the standard that we have. So perhaps some of the reparative justice ought to be to help them to have a health service at least as good as ours. That would be justice. Maybe even paying for some of the nurses that we've helped to come to Britain, who've made a massive contributions to our lives here. But it's that perception that we've not made a contribution, that we're not currently doing so, that has to be challenged. That's a myth. And that is all about representation. So we have to defend our representation in public life and in the history and the storytelling of this country. So I hope that the contributions that people have made to that story and that narrative are helping to shift the debate about who Scotland is, what Scotland is, and also what is our history as a global Scot. Who is a global Scot? Who are the people who are considered Scots? Because people with my name are walking the earth in West Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Indian subcontinent, in Hong Kong. Why? Because Scots were there. That's why we are here. Therefore, if we have a proper telling of our story, yes, it's uncomfortable. These truths are difficult, but a proper representation of us in the story of Scotland as a global footprint on the whole planet will give us an honest assessment. It will give us also, Scotland, a chance to make amends through reparative justice with the countries that we are mentioning here, having more equal trading relations, more equal human interactions, twinning of organizations, twinning of educational institutions, a leveling up. These are the contributions our country could make to making reparative justice a reality. Now, finally, I'm going to talk about representation in the electoral sense. Clearly, people need to see what they can be. And I've had it regularly said to me that the lack of BME teachers in the classroom, considering in Glasgow it's less than 1%, when our student body is 20%, that has an effect, because it means that child in the classroom doesn't see that education could be a career path for them, because they can't really see somebody of their background doing that in the place where learning and official respect and culture is delivered. We need representation at every level, but in the political sphere, and I can say this from personal experience, that it's obviously difficult, and I know this from speaking to representatives from other parties who've gone through this, that the culture of political parties is such that it's quite difficult to get that level. In the old days, decisions and political meetings used to take place in pubs, and so if you come from a culture that doesn't drink or doesn't smoke and doesn't work part of that, it was difficult for you. You had to compromise your principles almost to go into a meeting. Thankfully, these days, people don't have meetings in pubs. They're more likely to have it in cafes. That's a good thing. They're more likely to have it at times when women might be able to make it if they've got childcare responsibilities. They may be more likely to have them in the ways on days of the evening, days of the week where we're not, at church or at mosque or at temple. These, we're starting to get lively to this, but political parties have still got a struggle in the way that they're structured internally. Part of addressing that from back in the day was self-organisation. And I personally know Diane Abbott. I knew Bernie Grant quite well. My dad is from Tottenham, so he was one of Bernie Grant's football soldiers back in the day in the Postal Office Union when they started the whole Black Sections movement. And he was a hero of mine, and he was certainly a hero of my dad's. The current MP for Tottenham was less so, but that's another thing. But he was massively important, Bernie Grant was, in the fight for black self-organisation within the Labour movement and within the Labour Party. And therefore, the black sections, the role they played, it was pivotal that the community came together with the trade unions and worked together to push the black people's agenda for equality within that movement and ask for allies to back us. And we did that, whether it meant on strike, whether it meant in unionisation drives, whether it meant when Bernie made this great stand over the Tottenham uprising where he defended the youth. That was a very brave thing to do back in 1985. But the fact that he said it and he did it paved the way for others to do the same. And I very much feel myself in kindred spirit to that approach to being a community activist who is also happens to be an elected person. I sort of had a background as a community activist in that sense. So I think BME people, because they have the strengths of community organizing at their hand, you already have a community at your faith community, you're already active in your cultural communities. That's where we already are. I really hate it when I hear it expressed by public bodies who are interested in trying to approach BME communities for information or input. Oh, we're so hard to reach. Oh, we're so difficult to reach. That's one of the things I really get annoyed about, because we're the most easy to find. Why? Because 90% of us worship. 90% of us are actively faith community members. Therefore, you know exactly where we are every Friday afternoon, every Saturday, and every Sunday morning. We're in exactly the same place. The whole community is there. If you want to find us, we're easy to find. All of the different minority ethnic groups. I think that applies to all of us. We're not difficult to find. You just have to be interested in hearing our voices and approaching us. So that's the first thing, is that how do we get approached? But then it's the other thing is, how do we approach others? What stances do we take? I think it's very important that, if you're a member of a BAME community and you want to be politically active, you want to be in a political party, if you have ambitions to be an elected person, I think the starting place has to be, don't join a political party because you want to be elected. Join a political party because you believe in what its philosophy says, but also, crucially, you must have allies in the wider community beyond your own community. You have to reach out. You have to do the outreach. We already have to do that anyway, because that's how we integrate into the wider society. We've always been good at doing that. That's something we know how to do. So if you translate that skill into the political arena, that means you take a position on a union committee, you take a position on the community council, you take a position on Friends of a Park in your area. It means taking active part in civic and cultural life beyond your own community. So reach out, find allies, find points of solidarity, find communities of resistance to make common cause with. And I'm as a BAME community, I'm very, very consciously aware of the need to reach out to other BAME communities who are going through now many of the experiences that my community went through in the 60s and 70s or 80s. And I've used a lot of that community activism experience in my daily life since moving to Scotland permanently 18 years ago. It was kind of ironic when I arrived permanently to live here in Sighthill in 2002, that I'd just come from Packham, where my house was just demolished after a big regeneration project, which was in North Peckham Estate, the very place where Damilola Taylor was murdered 20 years ago. My office, in fact, my place was directly above that stairwell. But that whole building and the whole community got demolished, and I lost my flat. I come to Sighthill, and nearly the same thing happens again, as this struggle we then launched around refugee rights and housing coming together in that storm between 2001 and the time I left in 2011. Well, my house was finally demolished, but we left it with a community that was intact, was united, had fought its ground to stay where it was and to work together. I mean, it was community members who showed the solidarity with their new neighbours, who took them to the pharmacies, showed them where everything was, where the doctors, where the school, where everything was. I have no doubt in my mind that the majority of people then and as now are actively and supportive against racism. And it's a question of how we mobilize and channel that. So I suppose our representation requires us to represent that best tradition of anti-racist grassroots struggle from below, which is what really the best grassroots politics is about. And I think without those experiences, there is no way I would have been an elected person, because I suddenly found that lots of people in the area where I now represent, in Springburn, were people who remember the struggle I put up in Sight Hill and Red Road Flats and have been moved to the area where I'm now representing. So it's got a nice, interesting circle, and I'm now very proud to represent those people. But people of all races remember the struggle I put up for the big thing that united everybody, which was around housing rights, keeping a community together, not having a working class community displaced so that private housing could be built. You have to make the connections. That's my big advice to anybody who wants to do politics. You have to make those connections between what makes you tick as a member of the BME community and what makes that wider community tick. It's only by challenging those presumptions that people might have, by showing that you have solidarity and showing that you can exercise solidarity with other people in your wider community, that you will be accepted as a leader that will fight for everybody's rights. And I think that's the best way to represent ourselves. It's the best way to open up those doors and to raise the ceilings of Black political representation. I'll finally end on this and say that I've been, as convener for the BAME network in the SNP for a year, I've been working to get that group to encourage people to stand for election. Right now, 22, yes, you heard right, 22 BME candidates are currently standing in the internal selections for the SNP. And that's an incredible number of people from Asian backgrounds, from Kurdish backgrounds, from Catalan, from African Caribbean. We've got, you name it, we've got it in amongst that 22 candidates. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting all of them to be successful, but the fact that there's so many says that we've got the self-organization bug within our movement. And I think that's required in all political parties and in all trade unions to get Black people involved in the running of our movements from below and from the top. Let's have more of them in the leaderships, in the parliaments, in the executives of the trade unions, on the General Council, everywhere. We need Black representation, because being in that room makes a real difference in terms of the perspective that we bring. That we know that racial equality is not a side issue, that it's centrally understood in an intersectional way, by the way. We can't be for racial equality and not be for the LGBTQ equality and not be for gender equality. You can't be a proper anti-racist unless you're an anti-sexist, an anti-misogynist, and pro and anti discrimination against LGBT community. So I'm very confident that we have a bright future, in the sense that we will succeed in the struggle against racism. The STUC is at the forefront now with the St. Andrew's Day demonstration and with the restarting of the Sheku Bayo campaign, fighting for justice for our community. Because if Black Lives Matter is to mean something very specific to us, it's not just a matter of we must have, we not be killed by the police, whether it's here or in the States or in London. It means to live a meaningful life free from discrimination and inequality. That's the future we hope for. That's the future we're fighting for, fighting to make now, in the here and now.
Councillor Graham Campbell, thank you very much for that very inspiring, motivating and informing contribution as part of this annual Black History Month lecture by the STUC. In particular, I was heartened to what you were saying in terms of BME representation in the workplace, how BME communities are portrayed, and also BME representation as an elected member as you are. And also thank you for just mentioning the St. Andrew's Day March and Rally, which this year, everyone, is happening on Saturday, the 28th of November, starting at 11 o'clock. It is a virtual rally, so it'll be broadcast on our usual social media channels, and I would ask everybody to tune in on the 28th of November at 11 o'clock in the morning to join us at that annual celebration and event as well. I'd like to now introduce Diljit, who's the Vice Chair of the STUC Black Workers Committee. Hello Diljit, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm very well, thanks. Thank you, Usman, and And thanks, Graham, for a really informative and thoughtful, thought-provoking lecture for us this year.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I would just like to kind of share a few thoughts, really, kind of drawing on what Graham's talked about tonight, and maybe sharing some of my own experiences. And I should also say, I know Graham mentioned earlier on that I am the first, I think he maybe said the first BME person to go on the executive of the MU. I will not, well, if I get elected, that is. I'll be the first South Asian, but certainly the first BME person from Scotland. So I just thought I would just clarify that, because we have the wonderful Millicent Stevenson already on the executive committee. So yeah, I wanted to touch on some things about culture and the arts, and also some observations I've made working in academia and museums, which are my workplaces, but also how they relate to wider society, and also touching on what trade unions have meant to me in terms of addressing issues of representation in sectors like arts and culture, where many of the workers are freelancers and precarious, and the music industry is a really good example of that. So I just wanted to start by noting the responsibility of civic institutions, our public cultural bodies, to provide society with good, accurate portrayals. And I know that's something Graham mentioned, about portrayals of people as part of representation of all the people who make up our communities. And I think for me, it's really important that minoritized people see themselves represented. I think that's a huge impact on young people. I know Graham mentioned the teaching workforce. Obviously, I count myself as part of the education workforce, working primarily in higher education. But that's it's really significant for young people to see people like them in positions as educators, as people who are influencing society. And I think good representation really requires cultural awareness. And that has to come often from within these underrepresented and minoritized communities. I think, as much as everyone has a responsibility to take that, to take on the mission of trying to represent all communities, you do need input from these specifics, because we're not at a place where there is enough cultural awareness that we can do it without community input. So I think what we need is better practice for working with communities, better work opportunities for our underrepresented employees. So in the case of arts and culture, and certainly something I've noticed working in the heritage sector over the past year, is that we are very, very often the ones on the precarious short-term projects. We are not embedded in the institutions. We come in and then we leave. And I think that institutions need to recognise their limitations in doing the job without assistance. That it's very easy to say, here's our multicultural event, here's our BME representation, here's our South Asian event, and not acknowledging that they actually need to have input from communities and from those with that sort of cultural knowledge. Among other things, I am an academic, as I've mentioned, and I hadn't actually realised that I had written off the possibility of being able to be both a parent and a professor and doing all that as a South Asian Punjabi Sikh woman, until I met people who were all of the above. And it's that power of seeing a reality, and I really think that can't be underestimated. And with that comes a lot of responsibility on those of us who are in these positions where we are the representation, for want of a better way of putting it. And that comes with responsibility. And it's something that I think people who are not minoritized need to really realize. If you don't experience underrepresentation, then you don't really realize what it means to be the only one in a working environment, which is basically what my experience has been in museums, in higher education, in the music industry, is often being the only one. Up until Graham joined the Musicians Union Regional Committee, I was the only BME person on the regional committee. I've been the first person to have attended a number of conferences on their behalf as a BME delegate. And so it's a responsibility that we haven't chosen to take on, to be that representative. And I think that's something that has to be acknowledged, is that when there is only one person, it's a huge onus on that one person. And so we need to be striving for better representation, so that the equalities work, so that this activism does not become an obligation, and so that labour can be divided. The other things I wanted to touch on was just kind of reflecting more broadly on arts and culture and how it treats other communities. We're still dealing with terminology like world music. One I've come across in museums recently is world cultures. And this sort of blanket othering term that just has zero nuance in terms of cultural diversity and does not help when it comes to issues of representation. If we want people to feel welcome in a workplace, we need to change how we're doing things so that it is a more welcoming place, so that we're getting rid of this archaic terminology that does nothing to further represent better representation. And in the case of South Asian representation, I think it's really important, particularly during Black History Month, to kind of make the case as to why in our South Asian representation we need to really, really tackle issues like casteism, like homophobia, and like anti-Blackness, because our current South Asian representation in media and in heritage does not tackle these issues. And I think that as part of that umbrella of BME communities, we have a responsibility to tell our whole truth. That whiteness isn't just about white people, it's also about those of us within other BME communities. So I think that's really important to highlight, particularly this month, but obviously all the time. And finally, just on being a freelancer, as I've mentioned, I've been, since I kind of joined the Musicians Union committees, I've obviously thrown myself into being very active, but wouldn't have done so without someone literally bringing me in by the hand. But I cannot stress how important that's been for me to raise issues as a freelance worker, because when you are underrepresented in what is already quite isolated work, it's really hard to meet other people in a similar position, because we are underrepresented, but also we are not in offices, we are not in daily contact with other workers. And so I think trade unions are really, really key for us to participate in. But again, it's that form of responsibility to come together to address the issues. So I'll leave it at that. I won't go in any more. But thank you for inviting me and giving me a wee moment to share my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Diljit, and good luck in your upcoming election as well. We are now going to turn to question and answer session, and I've been observing quite a lot of the questions, and Graham, I'm glad that you've been able to stay with us to join in this as well. So the first question that I'd like to turn to is one from Gordon, if you'd want to bring that up on. Yeah, that's great. Gordon Gray asks if there is one thing that we could all do to help address the inequality and discriminatory practices, what would that be? So, Graham, do you want to take lead on that one?
There is not one thing, is there? Just the council motion, there was 25 things that we had to do just to simply, try and have a fairer way of employing people. But I suppose it's making the supposedly invisible discriminations visible. And a lot of the time, the microaggressions we face and the subtle exclusions are almost worse, because with direct, nasty, horrible racist people, you know how to deal with them because they dislike you, they're irrational, they're not relevant. But it's the people who have power and control over processes that will affect your life and your chance to get a job or get into a workplace or get a promotion or get the respect of your colleagues. It's those subtle microaggressions which are often only noticed by us. But I think we have to ask our white colleagues, and indeed our colleagues of other backgrounds, to notice when this happens and to back us up when they see it happening. Because quite often the patronizing tones that we're talked back to, the presumptive, you say something and they ignore that, but when a white person in the room says exactly the same thing and rephrases it, they take lots of notice of it. Notice that and point it out that it's rude and disrespectful. It's great when our white colleagues do that when we're in a room. Because trust me, if it's tiring to have to confront racists or subtle forms of racism, it's way more tiring and frustrating for us to have to do that. And we often don't sweat the small stuff, because frankly, if you spent all day trying to deal with the microaggressions, you would have no energy left to deal with the big question. So my biggie is really just notice it when you see it, when it's pointed out to you. Back up your BAME colleagues in the room.
Thank you. And do you want to add anything?
Oh, sorry, I think there's a bit of echo going on there.
Into that?
Are we sort of that? Sorry. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it is just, yeah, like Graham says, it's just that awareness. It's that let's just name the things already, and you know, it's bystander culture. I think, yeah, like Graham said, yeah, there's any number of things, but I think that's a huge one, is for people to step up and point things out, but also going away and educating yourself. Stop asking people to take on labour when you could Google it. You know, we live in an internet age. Most people do have ready access to be able to answer a lot of their questions. So do your homework before you ask them. Take on some of the labour.
Yeah, absolutely. So just, what I'd like to add on that is something which we're trying to do with Break the Day Ceiling campaign, which is embed this new approach called Understand First, Act Second. So before any actions are actually taken, including into improving, you know, recruitment, retention, progression, addressing systemic barriers that organisations may face, regarding, you know, improving the BAME workforce, is actually this need to understand first. And, you know, right away, if you look at the Equalities Act 2010, there's actually 14 different groups that make up Black, Asian, minority ethnic. And it's actually understanding there is not a one size fits all, that every one of those groups is different and diverse in itself. And, you know, we need to do quite a lot to kind of educate ourselves. And sticking to the education theme, Danielle asked a very good question in terms of understanding, and her question is, do you have any recommended reading for someone who wants to understand Scotland's role in slavery in more detail? And I thank some of the other people in the audience who are beginning to answer this to Danielle as well, but I wanted to offer it to you, Graham, and to Dilji, to see if you have any selected reading that Danielle could turn to.
The first place I would start, if you're a Glaswegian, is you need to read Dr. Stephen Mullen's It Wisni Us, The Truth About Glasgow and Slavery. Start with that, and that's the best first place to start. In addition, academic works you can read on the maritime history of the triangular trade in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, indeed all of Scotland's role in the slave trades, and also the gun running to the southern United States. Dr. Eric J. Graham is, I would consider, our go-to person. He's an Edinburgh-based historian. He is the expert on Scotland's maritime history in relation to slavery. I would also, on the abolitionists, there's a book by Reverend Dr. Ian White. His book is about Glasgow's abolitionists, so look him up. That's White with a Y. So definitely look him up. The work of Dr. Christine White, also with a Y, at Glasgow University, who's one of the founders of the Beniba Centre. Her work is really about Sierra Leone's link to the slave trade as well. Scots were very involved in the slave island called Bunce Island, which traded enslaved Africans from there. So her work is very important. I would say also Dr. Peggy Brunash's work on the history of textiles and the cultural side of things. I mean, if you know about Jamaican culture, we have dances called kuminas and John Canoe, and the national costume that we wear is a tartan-based costume. It has its origins in slavery. So there's the historians who have that kind of understanding. So I would certainly go to those people first. There's many others I could probably mention, but they don't come to my head just now. Apologies there.
So fantastic. Sorry, I think we're just waiting for other people's. Yeah, sorry. Sorry for the sound issues there. No, thank you, Graham. I think, you know, we will certainly get some of those links from yourself after today's event, and we will post them on the STUC social media sites as well. So those who are interested, please do keep an eye on that. to get those links. I see my good friend Raza Sadiq has posted a question. So if we can turn to Raza's question, which is, what's stopping to shift underrepresentation of BME? Is it happening on the pace which will take 50 plus years as population is increasing? What's the current breakdown in Glasgow City Council? If I can begin by answering this one, Raza, this is something which Break the Race Ceiling campaign is doing in Glasgow City Council, has recently responded to our campaign response, and we'll be publishing these in due course. But I think Graham also had some of that breakdown information and that level of data, as he says, through the employment group. Graham, is there anything you want to come in and add to that?
Up. I'm going to just get the exact data, but give me a moment. If you can
sure.
Give me a moment, I will get the exact data up.
Okay.
I need to go into my wonderful device to get it.
Okay. So, can we go to, in the meantime, Malcolm's got a question on education. Maybe if I can bring Diljit into that whilst Graham is looking up for the required information. So Malcolm Dunn has asked, thanks Malcolm for your question firstly, but Malcolm's question is, do you know the proportion number of people from BME communities who currently study to go into teaching profession? Do you think schools and careers services promote teaching as a relevant profession to strive for? Yep.
Yeah, so I know actually, and I've noted in the comments there that Cockleb Stewart has highlighted Rowena Arshad's report, Teaching in a Diverse Scotland, which has some stats in there. And I would say that, I mean, as much as there is still huge underrepresentation, I do think the education sector has changed a lot in the past 10 years. I'm pleased to say I know a lot of BME colleagues in Scotland who work across schools, further and higher education. And in terms of careers and schools promoting it, I mean, I don't have any hard sort of evidence or knowledge on this, but I would say that my experience of looking at general provision in schools is that it always tends to be a postcode lottery. It really depends on the teachers, it depends on the careers advisors, and I think that contributes to the kind of the unpredictability of it. I think that increasingly teaching is getting a better rap in terms of a prospective career, and I've noticed kind of from being a school pupil myself to kind of coming out the other side of it, and having lots of BME peers who've gone on to train as teachers, I do notice a shift there. So I don't know what the numbers are, but I would say it's increasing, which is good. And as for schools and career services, I think, you know, again, I think that's an area that could, if it's not already been researched, certainly is one that could and should be looked at, actually, because what my research into kind of music career trajectories has shown is that it's very, very easy for young people to be turned off from a particular career path, and it is very much dependent on who they have access to at school in terms of teachers as role models, but also family members. And that's for teaching more generally, kind of not kind of bringing race into it, is that future teachers generally are influenced by their own teachers, but also teachers in the family, teachers amongst family friends, and their relationship with the education system. So it is a complex area in terms of those decisions, and I think it's something that needs looked at as part of the underrepresentation issue.
Absolutely, thanks very much for that, Diljit. I see that there's another question from Raza, and I want to kind of address that as well. So it's very important with, do you think it's important to move away from cultural awareness rather than challenging structural inequalities? And I guess there was something that Graham said earlier around there only being now one head teacher in Glasgow. And I think just because there's one doesn't mean that we should stop there, that we should give ourselves a pat on the back. Absolutely not. I think we need to keep going. I think understanding cultural awareness is certainly something which is one of the foundation building blocks. But on the other end to that is actually the need to tackle some of those structural issues that Graham was referring to, and certainly. So Diljit, sorry, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on that because I think for me, and this is maybe specific to the environments I'm working in, but for me, the two go hand in hand because the structural issues are rooted in a lack of cultural awareness, actually, because it's the notion that we have a structure that has been built for one homogenous group, and that is where the inequality lies. And actually, by having cultural awareness, you can then tackle the issues around how things are structured.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why, as I said, for Break the Race Ceiling, the way we've structured this campaign and we were talking to all the employers is that you need to do the understanding first before you do the recruitment, before you do the retention, before you do the progression. And by the way, you will not be able to achieve all of the aforementioned without tackling the structural barriers. So that is basically the argument that we are making with the campaign. Graham, have you got the data? Do you want to come back in on that earlier question about the data?
Apologies, I can't find the specific document I wanted, which has the breakdown by department.
Yeah,
but
that's fine.
I have the overall numbers though, which is we currently have about 680 BAME identified employees. Now, one of the problems we have in the stats in the workforce, that's about 200 or so more than it was when we started, but it still is underreported in some respects. I mean, for example, the teacher workforce at one stage when we started this process was 30% non-disclosed. And part of that was down to many teachers would have joined the council years and years and years before we did racial equality monitoring. So part of that is to get each one to follow that and put it through. So one of the tasks we've had is to reduce that lack of reporting, and so trying to get people to fill out monitoring forms so they could get a more accurate picture. So it's quite possible that the teaching workforce is slightly more diverse than the stats tell us, but probably not is the likely truth. So to answer that previous question, I'm pretty convinced that until we iron out some of the structural problems, and one of them, and I'm talking out of turn here, but I'm sure nobody's listening, so if the education department is listening, please switch off now. But our department, in my view, has done a lot of work. It contributed a hell of a lot towards the minority ethnic teachers report that came out last year. A lot of that data came from Glasgow, so it was welcome. It said what steps we should take to recruit more teachers. But the reality is that the way teachers are recruited in our schools, for example, every term, the head teachers have to recruit from a pool, a ready-made pool of teachers who are qualified in chemistry, maths, or whatever it is. But how do you join that pool when they don't advertise vacancies to that pool so that BME teachers can be in the pool to be selected from? The head teachers, 30 of them in the high schools, don't have the discretion to decide to choose to have a BAME teacher if their workforce is unbalanced in some way. So even though the law does allow them to some leeway to do that, our structure actually prevents them from acting on it. So that's one of the things we're going to have to address, is that actually how we recruit teachers. And I tell you, I've actually sat on panels recruiting deputy heads and head teachers. And one of the structural inequalities, of course, is the lack of black parents involved on parent councils. Because guess what? The panel that recruits a senior head teacher is 3 people from the parent council, 1 head or a deputy head from another school, and 1 councillor. So guess what? They tend not to, at interview level, employ black people. Suddenly, when a black person's there in the panel, they consider it slightly more. So guess what we did? Rocket science, we decided to have some black people on panels. And that massively changes the dynamic in how even the other people in the room react to a candidate and how they consider their proper qualified basis of applying for that post. So these are the sorts of things that we're going to have to change institutionally to make it possible for more black teachers to enter the profession. It's not a shortage of people who are in education. Given that, you know, the numbers of BAME people who are actually educationally degree level qualified, and the importance culturally they give to education to their children, you would have thought that education would be the one profession where we would massively be dominating. But the stats don't lie. They tell you that we've actively discriminated. We've got processes which stop them coming into the profession. So one of my tasks is the back labouring in that committee to make sure that we remove these barriers. In terms of the wider question, there's obviously some different partners or different cultures of how we recruit. I mean, some of them are just the old school. I remember working in cleansing myself in London back in the day, and I walked into the job, spoke to the depot manager, and he decided to hire me. and then same guy decided to fire me when I was trying to be unionised. But that's another story. But it's that type of old school culture which still exists to some extent in how some of us are recruited into our jobs, and of course those things are going to exclude black people. So we have to change these practices and make them publicly transparent, clear, and measured and consistent right across the country, and also within our authority. So I want to make sure that the same diligence that's paid in some departments who've been successful at increasing their BAME workforces. I can tell you that, say, for example, Green Education Development have been very successful, DRS have been successful, education much less successful. So we can use the lessons we've learned. We've got peer-to-peer support within the staff to encourage people. We even set up a Facebook group, by the way, of applicants so that they could correspond with each other privately outside the council to say what it was like to apply for a job for us. So we get that reported back for a confidential feedback, and that's a sort of whistleblowing almost before people even get to be in the council, so that we have some idea what it's like to actually apply to us. And where we've seen obvious examples of exclusion, I've personally intervened in some where I've seen that somebody who's a civil engineer has got direct experience of building civil engineering projects in their country is not even shortlisted for a job that's actually something they've already done. I've actually intervened and made sure they at least got interviewed. And that's that power of being a member of the authority gives you, that you can intervene. And I appeal to anybody out there, if you know of an example of dodgy or discriminatory practice that you've seen my authority practice, let me know about it and I will intervene.
Absolutely. On that, one thing I would note is that Glasgow is not alone. Out of the 41 responses we've had for Break the Race Ceiling campaign responses, the analysis I've certainly seen is that there are a few other councils out there, particularly when they include the teaching numbers as part of their workforce, that BAME workforce number jumps up a little bit. And it's when you further explore the gaps and inconsistencies that there are across other bits of the organisation. I am also just conscious of time, so I just want to once again thank our panel, our panelists, Diljit and Councillor Graham Campbell, and also thank Graham for being the guest speaker at this year's annual STUC Black History Month lecture. And I would say that if any questions have not been answered or we've committed to taking away and answering, we will make them available at a later date on our social media and website platforms. So please do keep up to date with that. And please do like the Break the Race Ceiling campaign Facebook page. It's growing every day, and there's some exciting activity coming. As I say, we are looking to publish the responses we've had to date for our campaign, and looking to publicly hold to account those that have not responded yet, and hopefully try and put some focus in terms of some of the actions, some of which we've explored and Graham's explored in his lecture, and Diljit has also added to in terms of answering the questions. I just want to do a kind of final shout out for the next STUC Black Workers Committee's event, which is the St Andrew's Day March and Rally, which we won't be doing in person. We will be doing it virtually, and that will be done on the morning of Saturday the 28th of November, and it'll start at 11 AM, and you can join in on the STUC social media pages. I would encourage you to all attend. Please ask your families to attend with you, and all your colleagues and friends as well. The more people we have, the better. One good way of doing it in virtual is that you can be a bit more inclusive, and people tend to be able to join no matter which bit of the country that they are that they reside in, or even parts of the world. We have had some of our events. We've had some international guests join us as part of our audiences, and they are all most very welcome. So as I said, that's going to happen on the morning of Saturday the 28th of November at 11 AM. And can I just say a very big thank you to you all our audience. You've been fantastic, very engaging. And thank you to Diljit, and thank you most of all to Councillor Graham Campbell for being our guest speaker this year. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again very soon.